Greetings. This presentation concerns Gebusi, Worlds of Change, or Part 2 of the Gebusi book, based in 1998. We can see the change in these initial pictures from the traditional dancing of Gebusi that was prevalent in the earlier period, and change of costuming and self-presentation as of 1998. Now, by 1998, Gebusi focused much more around the station of Nomad, the government station, and its manicured lawns, its palm trees, its government buildings, and the Mission Aviation Fellowship airplanes, which came in several times a day often, with many cargoes coming in and people and interchange with the outside world. There was certainly a sense of development. So people like Howie here, this picture was taken in 1981, really had a transformation in their own lives. Here's Howie in 1998. He had been trained at a mission school. He's now the cargo manifest manager for the Mission Aviation Fellowship airline, locally based in Nomad, weighing the things that go on the plane, making sure they're not overweighted, and so on. Here's Howie again on Sunday in the Evangelical Church, translating from Tokpisin. The pastor on the right is speaking in the national language of Tokpisin, and Howie is translating to the local vernaculars while holding a poster in the church. Sayu, my friend who was about 5 years old in 1980, had grown into quite a strapping young man, a very eligible bachelor and quite flirtatious with the ladies. And then there's me in my Wolfman period from the early 1980s to the haircut that Sayo gave me. In fact, we were our gift exchange name laid down was Gisai, or cut hair, which is also a metaphor for a young person. He left a little fringe on my forehead there with the battery-operated clippers that I brought into the field. And this is the house I lived in 1998, which Gwabi, the man next door, very, very generously lent me for the time that I was there. And relaxing on my porch, I was solo. I was going alone in 1998, which is a different experience, and it bonded me more with the men, and it also made it a challenge to deal with the women because of the gender segregation. Here I am with a number of guys in a lean-to area waiting to go to a forest feast. And one of the big changes was, for the first time, I had some solar power, which allowed me to generate electricity for my laptop computer. So I had a laptop computer for the first time, which made a tremendous revolution in being able to take notes and things, keep track of information. As long as the solar panel worked, the pigs ate the wires to the solar panel. At one point I had to splice them back together and almost lost the whole system, but I managed to limp along successfully. So the contrast from the early days, there's my Wolfman self pulling carbon paper out of the manual typewriter, which is where I took notes. But that was a transformation, obviously, to the 1998 period. So Gebusi here, you can see their shaded territory on this map. And before, they lived in the village of Yibihilu, right on the Kum River. And now they had moved very, very close to the Nomad station at Gesumi Corners. The entire community of Yibihilu was now defunct, and they had moved to the outskirts of the Nomad station, and that had revolutionary consequences. It's not uncommon for Gebusi villages traditionally to only last 6 or 8 or 10 years, but the moving to a more permanent settlement by a government station was unprecedented. Here are some shots taken from my veranda at different weather conditions in Gesumi Corners, and the area is more cleared out, so there's a larger vista to see with large trees in the distance. And you really feel the weather coming in. You feel like you're the different modes and moods of temperature and rain and sun are very dramatically felt. Here's a storm coming in. And here's my friend Gwabi, the one who let me the house I was living in, who's cultivating sweet potatoes, which was a crop that was very seldom used in 1980 to 82, but now has become a starch staple. Very nutritious, and the mounding techniques for growing it, they've learned from outsiders. And so it's a crop which was not introduced, but is now in much greater provenance and made a big influence in improving their nutrition. Here's manioc. So other introduced crops also start becoming important for Gebusi to give them a greater breadth of their diet. And their gardens are larger with the steel axes and knives being able to clear much larger gardens. So their nutrition has actually gone up. And the market, which is described in chapter 8 is very important now. Twice weekly, the women of Gebusi Corners and other villages as well bring their produce to sell at market. So you can see large tubers and greens and wrapped sago and sweet potatoes, which are sold for 10 or 20 or 30 cents to the government workers who are salaried national employees who have cash wages, and their wives and the husbands sometimes come and buy this food. So there's a growing cash economy even at a very small level, and the women from Gebusi Corners and other places very regularly bring their produce to market on Tuesdays and Fridays as described in chapter 8. Even though the proceeds they earn are very, very small, it brings them into a sense of being modern, a sense of being agents of selling things for cash at a local market. The school situation also transformed. In Yibihilu, it was impossible for any children to go to school because the distance was too far, and the school was relatively low level. And now, children from many communities, including Gebusi, go regularly to the nomad school. The teacher in the foreground, Joseph Sakalau, is actually from a different province of Papua New Guinea, but the language of instruction is English, very simple English, or Tokpisin, the lingua franca of the country as a whole. And the local children learn English and Tokpisin in school because there are many different tribal groups with different languages which go to the school, so children can't speak one language, a vernacular language, among themselves. So they're brought into a larger mix with each other, and as well as learning more about the outside world. Here's another one of the teachers from a different part of Papua New Guinea who is teaching numbers to grade school children who are sitting cross-legged on hardwood floors of the school, teaching them arithmetic. And you can see the children are all dressed, and there may be 50 or 60 of them sitting in a baking hot schoolroom with no air conditioning or fans and 100-degree heat and a metal roof on top. But they're learning arithmetic, and the bonding together of different children and learning at least rudimentary educational things like mathematics is very, very significant to their life, and they're very diligent in the large part in doing so. Here are schoolboys during a recess break, joking around for the camera, and they have gravitated very much toward modern occupations. When I did a little draw a picture contest to try to ferret out what images of the future these Gebusi children and others in other areas nearby wanted to do in their future, they drew pictures like this. I want to be a mine worker in the future, says Tony Semo, with pictures of heavy machine operated equipment of the mine, which is many days walk away, but they've heard about it. And interestingly, in this picture, they picture the mine as being beneficial to the environment, where the smiling sun in the upper left and the flying red bird of paradise and the tree growing, whereas in fact we'll find that there's environmental degradation which was quite horrific as a result of this mine. Many of the girls drew pictures of wanting to be a nurse in the future or a teacher in the future. I want to be a teacher in the future, going to school. This is a garden project. Sometimes the teachers plant flowers and have other outside gardening techniques that they teach as part of kind of a horticultural class in school. And many of the boys, in fact a significant number, drew pictures of themselves as in the police or in the army. The idea of being a powerful person with education and weapons who could have force and control of other people was very important to the boys when they envisioned their future. Here's a young man who wants to be a policeman, and these police uniforms and the postures and so on drew clearly from the nomad police who were stationed there at the time, and that the children knew the government police station was only a few hundred yards from the schoolhouse itself. So here's the actual constable at Nomad in 1998. Constable Gobi, quite an amazing guy, very soft-spoken and very fair and judicious. He had a weapon, but he never used it except for a couple of occasions to shoot tear gas to dispel a belligerent crowd. But he was a very respected person, very educated, and listened carefully to disputes brought to him from different areas, and was a real mediator. So he was more of a dispute resolution conduit than someone trying to have armed coercion as a dominating feature of police life upon the local people. Sports also had become very important. These are all things that were revolutionarily new for Gebusi. Here they're playing rugby on the government ball field just across from the flagpole in the central government station, and they had refereed matches with uniforms, and some guys even had cleats and shoes, and timed matches with the bullhorn sounding and score carefully kept, and all-star games and so on. So sports on the weekends, participating, and with throngs of visitors around the outside, you can see, had become very important to Gebusi, whereas it had virtually been non-existent in 1980 to 82. So a whole series of changes in schooling, in market, and then also in religion. One of the things that greatly surprised me in this draw a picture exercise that I did with the children was that several of them drew pictures of wanting to be in heaven in their future. They foresaw themselves in the future as being in heaven. This is clearly an analog of the Christian teachings that we'll hear about shortly, in terms of the posters and the idea of envisioning oneself as aspiring to a Christian God in an afterlife. And here's the local pastor, Cyril Afanong. He's not a Gebusi, and he doesn't speak Gebusi very well. He's from a different part of Papua New Guinea. He's become educated in the national language and some degree in English, and he's reading from the Tok Pisin Bible, and you can see verses from the Bible in the background in Tok Pisin, and so the translation of these words into the local vernacular. Some Gebusi increasingly spoke and understood Tok Pisin, and others of them learned or through translation got the meanings that way. And church attendance became very important at this stage. The idea that the God of these outsiders is a powerful God, a God who's rich, a God who has great understanding, and we need to subordinate ourselves to gain from his beneficence, and the reflection of the outsiders who had clothes, who had nice houses, who had commodities, who could read, who were literate, who had education, who had money, became a focus of aspiration, of which religion and religious aspiration became one significant part. Now, the complexities of the cosmology and religious teaching can be condensed and iconized, as it were, into these church posters. Here's a church poster of the beginning of the sequence in which the good news in the Bible in the upper left is outside the dark heart of man. And the dark heart of man has the fire of the Lord burning outside of it, and the features and forces of tradition, including the red bird of paradise in the upper left, the cassowary, which is in the headdress, the pig, the frog, and so on, are guarded by the devil with a trident in the middle. And the eye of the Lord and the mouth of the Lord, right underneath what's the throat of the man inside the dark heart, are closed. Now, gradually, the good news starts to become more evident to people, and this is the story of Christian conversion, and the heart starts to lighten up. The fire gets a little brighter, the face gets lighter, the eyes start to open up. The grip of the devil on the features of tradition inside the dark heart start to loosen. And then the risk of dying, here is a man who's being held by a relative who's dying, and his soul is reaching out from inside of himself, but he's been profligate in life. He's been consumed by drinking beer here and chewing betel nut, which is a little narcotic chewing substance, stimulant, playing cards and being concerned about money. And his soul is obviously going to burn in hell in his afterlife, and everybody is very sad and sorry. Now, as a contrast to this, the possibility that the book of the Bible comes inside the heart of man, and the eye starts to open, and the mouth becomes open, and the cross comes inside, and the devil holding the forces of tradition is extruded to the outside of the heart, and then gradually the heart lightens up. It literally becomes enlightened. The smile opens up, the eye and the mouth open up, the good news shines more brightly, the fire of the Lord burns inside the heart, and then the forces of tradition are extruded to the outside, the red bird of paradise, the cassowary, the rat, the pig, the frog, and so on. And eventually, in the story of Christian conversion, the idea is that there's a certain kind of reinforcement layer or wall of protection around the heart to keep the devil and the forces of tradition from coming in. And there are actually passages from the Bible that are alluded to here. So the reader is literate and is able to understand the Bible with great joy and happiness. And Jesus is there to save you. And even if you're dying, the idea is that your soul will rise up and be elevated to heaven. So, in recapitulating the drawing of the school child, here is a depiction of death, a happy death as opposed to a sinful death. The book of the Bible is opened on the man's chest. the relatives are crying and they're sorry, but his soul is going to fly up to heaven accompanied by a white angel. So clearly a set of pictorial transformations about the idea of heaven and God replacing the traditional spirits of the spirit seances and the traditional world. Now, the teachers and the pastors were both literate, and so school and church became kind of parallel exercises. Both had a blackboard and back in which verses or things would be written. Both had a strong pedagogical notion of reading by the instructor, the pastor, or the teacher, and then passively listening among the congregation or the students in the class. And the receptivity or the openness to this was very evident, even though people still kept their traditional beliefs and there was kind of a hybridization, but they were increasingly influenced by Christian ideas. So here's a photo of Dolii, the young man we saw in part 1 with his yellow initiation costume, now is in a very snappy yellow t-shirt and a hat, which I gave him. And he has served 5 years in prison in the capital of Port Moresby because he beheaded a sorcerer, a person accused of being a sorcerer, for having accused of ensorceling his first wife, who was Sayu's own mother, Boyle. And having done this deed and turning himself in, he became a stalwart Christian and converted and said, I am now a new person. My soul has been exchanged. I won't kill anybody anymore. And now I'm a devout Christian. So he had a change of heart and a change of circumstance, which was a very powerful example to a number of people. And he came back to live in the village, and he was a stalwart member of the Catholic Church. So overall, by 1998, Gebusi religion had changed from being completely non-Christian to, at this point, being 59 or almost 60% baptized Catholic, and 22% evangelical Protestant, 3% Seventh-day Adventist, and the 3% was Ui's family. And chapter 7 of the book, in part 2, describes the hard conversion that Ui very much wanted to undergo in becoming a Christian to really demonstrate his commitment to a new way of living. And 16% non-churchgoers, they're largely the younger men who, once they marry, they often get baptized and start to go to church. So you see a real sea change in Gebusi religion. And how much this is a superficial change and how much it's really deep is an interesting question that people have asked in Christian conversion in many guises over the decades and even the centuries. Now, a parallel phenomena, which was very interesting to me given the way that homicide had been so important during the early period, the pre-colonial and early post-colonial period among Gebusi. So through 1982, when my first fieldwork ended, I had already documented, as mentioned before, a reduction of homicide, but the overall rate was still quite extraordinary. And with the absence and departure of the colonial officers from Australia, in some parts of the country there was an increase of warfare and violence without the colonial mandate of police and so on under colonial control to suppress violence. So some parts of the country saw an upsurge of violence following independence, and there was a question mark as to whether the Gebusi rate of violence would increase or stay the same or go down by the time that I got there 16 years later in 1998. What was the change? So what I found was there had been a decline of spirit mediums and seances, not because the Christian pastors or priests had suppressed them, but because Gebusi went to sing Gionfula, as they said, in Sunday morning to the church in church service, as opposed to singing with the spirit mediums at night. And the few spirit mediums who were left, some of them converted, either died or gave up the practice or converted to Christianity themselves. So spirit mediumship, which was the key linchpin for divining sorcery and for fomenting antagonisms around sorcery accusations and other disputes, was kind of taken out of the cultural puzzle. And correspondingly, there was a decline of sorcery, divinations, and fights. They still occurred, but they were much less virulent and less frequent. And collective retaliation became more difficult to arrange because before, if someone had been accused of a sorcerer, then almost everybody in the village might agree that they were in fact a sorcerer and deserved to be killed. Whereas now, some people might agree and some people might disagree. One person even said Satan might be trying to convince us the person's they're a sorcerer and they're not. So there was more ambivalence about these things. So the strong sense of collective retaliation being legitimate was undercut. And then increased association of sorcerers with evil spirits. So maybe Satan and evil spirits and sorcerers were in cahoots with each other, and that believing in God would dispense that. That was a minority belief, but it was significant in combating a unilateral tide in belief in sorcery. So, as a result of all these things, the rate of homicide as a percentage of all deaths actually declined quite significantly by 1998. There had only been 3 killings, including the one perpetrated by Dolii that I mentioned before, plus 2 others in the entire period of 16 years. And given the population size and so on, that's a reduction from 19% down to 5.1% homicide. And we'll see later that that decline of rate of homicide has continued for quite a long time. So it's been quite a drastic and continuing and important change. Now, as opposed to divination by corpse, in which the suspect is enjoined to shake the corpse and may be judged guilty and maybe even killed on the spot for corpse divination, being the person responsible, deemed responsible for the sickness death. In this case, my friend Argon, my breadfruit, his gift exchange name with me, died, sadly, and I was with him very few hours as he was dying at the health clinic. After he passed away, he was dressed in his Sunday best in a white shirt and placed with flowers and decorative objects around him in a Christian grave and buried rather than having a corpse divination, which kind of symbolizes and illustrates the change of religious values. So here's the community gathering around the grave with the Catholic catechist and lay pastor reading services over Una's body. He was a member of the church, and he's being honored in that fashion as opposed to in a corpse divination. Now, other changes had affected Gebusi society and culture too. The advent of clothes was much more prominent. Partly were ones that we brought in ourselves because people really wanted clothes. We wanted to bring them the things that they wanted. And they really enjoyed getting dressed up for feasts. And so there was a hybridization or a combination of different kinds of elements now in feasting, some traditional and some more modern, such as modern style clothing. Here's a hybridization very clearly evident in a man who was one of the translators and interpreters who gained a little money from that service during the colonial era, and he was one of the slightly more wealthier persons. He has a traditional style red bird of paradise, which he's put in a Western style hat. So you can see kind of very clearly the combination of Western and indigenous elements with his sunglasses and his Western style shirt. So in the mix of all this, what happened to the traditions of people in Gesumi Corners? Well, on National Independence Day, to celebrate the independence of Papua New Guinea in mid-September, the different, quote, tribal groups around Nomad, including Gebusi, but also many others, some with different languages, came to show their folkloric display of traditional customs for public viewing on the government station grounds. So here, welcome to the Nomad Youth Show 1998 from Deba Fall, and they're dressing in a traditional kind of, not exactly traditional, but we might say neo-traditional garb with a man in a t-shirt in the background. And the people from Gesumi Corners displayed traditional dancing as would have occurred, say, at an initiation, with the long crayfish claw rattle and the crocodile drum and the egret feathers and the woman with the rattle and so on and so forth. But this is now not done as a sign of initiation in the middle of the night for a throng of indigenous Gebusi villagers, but rather a crowd of over 1,000 people ringing the government ball field in the harsh light of day for competing for prize money in a kind of a folkloric competition. So here's a government officer with a Michael Jackson t-shirt holding an umbrella to shield him from the sun, who's observing the dance and going to give it a rating score, which will compare with other performances from other tribal groups to see which one will get government prize money. And that prize money was one of the main reasons why people decided to have these performances to begin with. They wanted to compete for the prize money. So the elements of a traditional spirit world are being pulled out and ripped out of context and re-performed in a very different way, as if they are folklore as opposed to for real. And the initiation costumes of some of the boys that were done were timed so that they would be able to be re-costumed right for the initiation display on the government ball field. And in some cases, these young men were not in fact initiated, but they were simply wearing the costume. And then also here you see the women lining up as they did in Yibihilu in the initiation in 1981 with parallel face paintings along those with the men. Now, this is the only spirit seance that I heard during the entire time of 6 months of residence in 1998 among Gebusi. And it wasn't a real spirit seance. It was a costuming of men, and men never got costumed like this during spirit seances, and they never took bows and arrows while they were singing or sang in quite this kind of formation. But the sign indicates that this is a restaging of traditional practices or traditional-like practices. And in fact, you can see the goalposts of the rugby field right on top of the crowd. And they dredged from memory seance songs, which they sang on the government ball field. But in fact, spirit seances were not held anymore in the villages. And as I mentioned before, this is one of the ways that the connection between the spirit world and their informing Gebusi about various things, including who's the sorcerer, was cut and much reduced, so it was much more difficult for Gebusi to act with confidence based on the spiritual direction as to who is the sorcerer and what retribution or divination should be taken. And in addition to Gebusi and other groups, different cultural displays of ceremonies and costumes that Gebusi did not practice were also evident. So this is a dance costume formation of a male and female dancing across from each other from the Badamani people, adjacent to the Gebusi, the traditional people that killed them in great numbers. And here everyone is very interested to see the different cultural groups and enjoy the display of their different costuming of something that's different from what they understand, and they're kind of enjoying the diversity of that. And individual costume performers would also paint themselves in elaborate garb, very traditional, and with great artistry, again competing for prize money in competition for individual costuming. Here are two men that are pantomiming themselves as corpses. You might remember from part 1 in the Gebusi traditional ceremony of initiation, there was a man who coated himself with mud and scared young kids as if he was a corpse, right, with a swollen penis and testicles. And here you can see kind of a papier-mâché covering that they somehow have configured with bark cloth and so in a very elaborate, creative way, including with masks, impersonating corpses with bloated bodies and swollen genitalia as a very dramatic display. And here's the same government guy with his hat in the background on the government ball field with government people rating which of the costumes is the most ingenious and deserving of prize money. Here's another pair of men from a different village who dressed up also as corpses with red ochre, and again the bug-out eyes and the sense. This one actually put a live little snake in his nasal septum squirming around, and again the symbolic portrayal of swollen genitalia, as would be the case if the person was actually a corpse. In addition to the more gruesome and kind of scary parts or pretendedly scary parts of this folkloric display were modern dancing. So here you see a man in kind of neo-traditional garb. He's wearing shorts, but he's also got a loincloth and various things. And a man in more Western garb with a modern style hat and so on, dancing in the disco competition. And this is largely only men dancing with men and a very few women, maybe mothers with their daughters, because it's much too salacious or risque to dance male versus female. But you see modern elements mixed in with the traditional elements as well. And then in the evening, they had skits of reproducing and representing tradition in a different way. And at this point, the villagers were so interested and geared toward becoming modern in the sense of they were surpassing and developing beyond their traditional ways, that they would make fun of their own traditional costumes and customs. So here's a man on the left portraying the role of a white patrol officer with his white socks and starched white shirt and shorts and sunglasses and cowboy hat. But he's a local villager. He's playing the role of a patrol officer, teaching this buffoonish, savage man, as they call them themselves, on the right, how to open a can of fish or how to read something. And the man on the right is with very, very farcical body humor antics, displaying that he doesn't know what's going on and so on. And people are laughing. There's a large audience of people that are watching this representation of traditional ways of life in a buffoonish, farcical way that is trying to mark the degree of modernity and the degree of distance that Gebusi had vis-a-vis and other tribal groups relative to their past. Now here's a photograph of the skit that the folks from Gesumi Corners put on, which is very dramatic. And this is my friend Mara, the one that came on to me for same-sex relations we had pictures of before, with, again, portrayal of a very large penis and testicles. And he's playing the part of a man who's dying and has just died with corpse fluid on him. And this is the actual Gebusi leader of the Catholic local church, Yamda, who's playing the role of a spirit medium, that his mother actually was a bit of a spirit medium, and he's trying to bring the person back to life in very crazy ways by yelling at him and so on. And people are laughing that this is a silly way to try to bring somebody back to life, but that was the custom. And then as part of the skit, they accused another man of being the source responsible for the illness death of Marat in the skit. And they killed him, so to speak, by beating heavily right beside his head and until he was dead. And then they ran off the stage and then came back and bowed in a fashion to show that it was only a skit. So they were mocking the traditional customs of killing people in sorcery. And here's a portrayal of another skit that kind of underscores that. This is the second coming of Jesus Christ. So here you have a villager dressed up. This is not the Gebusi Corners, but another village, dressed up as Jesus coming back in the second coming, with a woman who's an angel with angel wings, and the angel of Gabriel with a big horn. And these are women who have not converted to Christianity, as pantomimed in the skit, who are wearing, there was actually no costuming like this, but they're wearing very pretty neo-traditional kind of costumes that are they have bras painted on themselves with ash, but they're actually bare-breasted, and they're heathens, and they have not been following the word of God. So when Jesus comes, they will die. So they wither on the ground and pantomime that they're dead. So there's a clear sense of transformation of culture from a traditional way to a modern one. And however much anthropologists might want to appreciate older customs, the drive of people, at least of Gebusi at this stage, was very much toward wanting more commodity goods, wanting more modern styles of acting, of believing, and participating in the school, the church, the market, the sports league, and various things to bring them into a modern style of life. They'd retained many features of traditional kinship and residence and feasting, but they gave up increasing dimensions of their realm of spirituality and violence with respect to sorcerers. Now, this was an uneven process, and it wasn't uniform, and there were some men and some appreciation of traditional culture, or what we might now call traditional culture, on its own terms. So here's Wobebi, along with his friend Camus, in 1998, dressed in a very stately traditional fashion, beautiful to my mind, ready to dance at one of the few villages that still was doing traditional feasting and initiation. And so they were on display in traditional terms. But Wobebi was very uncomfortable playing the modern role of getting dressed up with sunglasses and trying to tease the women and use jokes. He was a very quiet guy, and he was a good hunter and a good house builder with traditional skills, but was not very comfortable at all, very felt out of place in terms of modern activities or the modern kinds of courtship. And he was the one that in chapter 9 of the book, I believe, was the one that wanted that Adam and Eve love potion to put around his eyes to attract women, because his traditional means of being strong and stalwart were not attracting women to him to be married. And he was definitely at the age that he could have and should have been married. Now here's the other side of that failed sister exchange that's described in that same chapter. This is Kwabum, and this is Magi. These are the real names, but I'd use pseudonyms in the book. And she was the one that was a very lively, you can even see from this picture, very friendly, smiling, vivacious, somewhat flirtatious young woman who got married in sister exchange. So she married the classificatory brother of Camus, and Camus' classificatory brother married Magi, so that there was two marriages together in which two clans were linked reciprocally. But when Magi fell out of favor with her husband and decided she couldn't be married to him, she exerted extremely strong agency of her own part to not be married, and she endured tremendous stigma, as described in chapter 10. But she held her own ground and broke that marriage, and as a result of that, Kubam's marriage also disintegrated as well. So both marriages were cut because the reciprocity was broken. So that's an indication of how strong the importance of reciprocity is. Even though Kubam would have been happy to stay with her husband, she wasn't going to do so because her clan would be so upset because the reciprocal marriage of a woman into the other clan was broken. And as we know from the end of that chapter, in the long run, after I left the field, Magi ended up as someone without a partner and very heavily stigmatized and without marital prospects that were more approved, married Wobebi, who was lacking a wife. So the two of them, and now I believe they have like 6 or 7 children by this point. So that marriage took, but it was an abrogation of what was intended at the time. The idea of a more modern family. This photo is surprisingly unusual because it was very unusual in the early days and even in 1998 to see a husband and a wife actually sitting together as a nuclear family couple with their child, Makus here. And the idea that the nuclear family of a husband and wife with the child was a unit was intensified in the village in ways that the social relationship between men and women being able to talk with each other casually and being less that the husband would be off with the men in a collective group and the woman would be off with the women in a collective group. And of course you see her very fancy, pretty blouse after the Sunday church service and the indication of change from that as well. So overall, I had a sense at this point of time that Gebusi social relations were really tending toward giving up their traditional ways of life. This is actually a true double exposure. The digital cameras in 1998 that I had available were not quite up to speed for what I wanted, so I took a very high-end celluloid film camera, single lens reflex, and this is a true accidental double exposure of a path down the forest path in the background and the fading image of a dancer. And I saw, wow, this is really symbolic of the fading of traditions. We'll see later that this seemingly unidirectional change toward development did not last, in fact. And we'll also note that the role of gender in this stage is underweighted, the importance of women and their separate roles. The pictorial representation of that in this presentation is less because my access to women was less, but the book tries to compensate for that to some degree in part 2 and then also in part 3. So thank you for watching and stay tuned.